Hello everyone, this is Charlie from the Bloomingdale Public Library, and today we're going to be discussing basic 3D animation with Blender. Now, I originally started doing Blender virtual courses as a way to promote our 3D print service, as well as hopefully spur on some more creative submissions versus things just pulled off the internet. However, 3D animation really doesn't pertain to anything like that. It's just something I thought would be fun to learn and teach, and so here we are. With that said, 3D animation is a beast of a topic, and we're not going to get into anything with motion capture or programming or dealing with timings. However, we will learn how to get things to move and change shape over time, and hopefully establish a pretty good foundation to learn more going forward. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. I think everyone knows what 3D animation is, but I always start with definitions, so we might as well be consistent. I didn't actually like any of the definitions I found online, so to put it in my own words, an animation is a collection of still images called frames shown in succession to give the illusion of motion. 3D animation is basically the same thing, except with the aid of digital tools to simulate a 3D space. So to put it all together, we're going to be using Blender to create frames to give the illusion of motion. When you go on the Blender docs online, they have 3 types of animation, and we'll try to touch on all 3. The first type is the most common type, and that's transformation, and that's where you show a change in location, rotation, or scale over time. Deformation is where you actually change the shape of an object over time, which is essentially moving the vertices around without removing or adding any more. Finally, we have inherited, and that's where the animation of an object is tied to another object. And just as an example, it's like where a train would have its cars following it, or another example would be where eyes are following an object. And it makes it nice and easy, so you don't have to actually animate the eyes manually. You can just lock them onto an object and not worry about it. So there's going to be 2 things we'll become intimately familiar with in our learning of 3D animation with Blender, and those are the timeline and keyframes. So we'll start with the timeline. The timeline is where you see all the frames of your animation, the frame you're currently editing, all the objects with animations, as well as their keyframes and markers. We'll go ahead and minimize things and take a look. So the timeline is actually included in the standard layout at the bottom. It might be hard to see if you have a small screen, but you can click and drag on this little border here. And this guy at the bottom here is our timeline. As you can see, the playhead starts at frame 1, not frame 0. I'm told you can go to 0 and negative, but it's generally not a good idea. Up at the top middle here, we have some controls for playing, stopping, and rewinding our animation. And next to that, we have a spot where we can type in a frame to jump to. If you're producing an animation of any length, you're going to be getting into the thousands, so that can be very useful. Or if you know there's a certain keyframe where something is happening, it's just easier to jump to it like that. And to the right of that, we have the stop and end frames as well. So by default, you end at frame 250, which at standard frames per second is only a couple seconds. At the same time, you might want to be looking over an animation that starts at a different frame, so you can change that too. So as you can see, our timeline is blank, and that will change in just a bit. Also, by default, they have everything kind of hidden on the left side, but if you click this little right arrow, you'll see the summary, and when I click the arrow, we don't have anything currently animated, so nothing shows up down here. But once you get stuff going, this will get very messy. Jumping back to our PowerPoint here, we'll talk about keyframes. And all a keyframe is a marker in time that stores a value of a property. So as the name suggests, it lives on just a single frame in the timeline, and we use keyframes for something called interpolated animation. So basically, we're going to produce keyframes on 2 frames, and then in between those 2 keyframes, Blender will do the animation load for us. If you come across the word extrapolation, that is where you animate the frames outside of the keyframes where again interpolated is the frames inside the keyframes. So pretty much any property can have keyframes attached to them. Typically you think of stuff just moving around, getting bigger and smaller, maybe mutating a little bit, but you can do other things too, like changing its physics, its colors, and things like that. Alright, so let's start creating some keyframes. I'm going to go ahead and use the default cube, both for simplicity's sake, and to keep the work laptop from blowing up, but this could just as easily be a bone in an armature. So we'll go through the steps of creating a keyframe. Step 1 is to make sure you are on the correct frame that you want to set the keyframe for. In our case, frame 1 is a good starting spot. Step 2, make sure the object is selected. We're good there. Step 3, change the property that you want to animate. In this case, we'll make it location. We'll move the cube over there. And then step 4 is to set the keyframe. And there's a couple of ways to do that. One way is to go through the menu. So you click Object, Animation, then click Insert Keyframe, and you'll notice the shortcut is the letter I. That'll bring us to the submenu, where we'll select Location, but you can choose Rotation Scale and any combination of those as well. When you do that, you've got your keyframe. You'll notice a diamond in the timeline on the frame we're on. You'll also notice over in the Properties panel that the properties that we set the keyframe on have turned yellow, and the dots have turned into diamonds. Incidentally, any property with a dot can have animation attached to it, and that's going to go for a lot of these menus. If we go to the Materials property panel, you'll see you can animate pretty much anything. So I'm going to undo that, and just to show a couple other ways to go about it, you can select the object, right-click in the viewport, and select Insert Keyframe, get the same submenu, get the same results, undo that. Again, the shortcut is the I key, you hit that, you go straight to the submenu. Click Location, same results. Another way to go about things is directly through the Properties panel. If you hold your cursor over the property you want to animate, hit I, you can see once again we've got our keyframe. Undo that. You can also click on the dots next to the properties, and you can see when we do that we can actually do the axes individually. And there's at least one more way to go about it, which I'll cover a little bit later. It's probably the most popular way. But in the meantime, we'll go ahead and set a keyframe here for location. And we're going to move this guy. So we're going to go to frame 40, select the object, change the property. In this case, we'll move it over here. Set the keyframe. Again, location. And there we go. You'll notice in our timeline we've got two keyframes rather, which means Blender can go ahead and interpolate in between them. So Blender again is creating all the frames in between our keyframes to give us our animation. So let's do it again, except this time we'll do it for scale. Going through the process again, go to the frame, select the object, change the property. Like I said, we're going to do the scale, so I'm going to hit S, drag it up a bit, set the keyframe. Again, we're setting scale this time. Now when I scrub back and forth on the timeline, that's probably not what you were expecting. So let's expand things out a bit. I click and drag on the top of the timeline here. Click on this little arrow. You see a general summary, so this is just going to be all the keyframes on any object. Click on the arrow, we can see a breakout by object and properties. You'll notice we've got our two keyframes here for location, but for scale we've only got one keyframe. That's the problem. In order to get the interpolation you need to have a beginning and an end point. So our problem is we never set a keyframe at the beginning. So let's go ahead and we'll undo things a bit. And we'll go to frame 40. And this time, we'll go ahead, set a scale keyframe to mark the beginning. Go to frame 80 again. Change the scale. Set the keyframe again for scale. Now when we scrub back and forth, we get a little more something like we were expecting. Okay, so that brings us to the last way you can insert a keyframe, which is with this little dot here on the timeline. If I roll over it, you see it says auto keying. And basically what you do is you set your keyframe typically on frame 1 for any property that you intend on animating, and then you set this auto keying, and from then on, any property that already has a keyframe attached to it will be animated and get its own keyframe anytime you make a change. So to demonstrate that, let's go ahead and go to frame 80 where we've already got things done. And this time we'll go ahead, insert a keyframe, and we're going to do location, rotation, and scale. So again, if you do this on frame 1 with auto keying attached, we'll go ahead and go to frame 120, and we'll change the scale back a little bit. There we go. And you'll see, even without inserting a keyframe, it does it automatically because there was a keyframe set on scale earlier in the timeline. It knew to go ahead and create a new keyframe anytime that property changed. So that is the basics of creating keyframes. So as we've been playing around, you probably noticed that things were changing color over on the right side of the screen. So I thought I'd talk about what these colors mean over in the Object Properties panel, because it can be helpful to know when your scene starts getting complicated. So we'll start off by selecting the camera. You'll notice when I do, everything is gray. Gray indicates that the property is not animated, and sure enough, we have not done anything with the camera today, so that is true. So we'll go back to the cube. You'll notice all of the properties are yellow. Yellow indicates that a property is animated and you are on a keyframe, which sure enough, we're on frame 120, so that is true. If we were to get off frame 120, you'll notice all the properties turn green. Green indicates that the property is animated, but you are not currently on a keyframe. If we get back onto a keyframe and start moving things around, you'll notice because we're changing the location value, it is turning orange. So orange means that you are on an animated property on a keyframe, but the values are different than what was previously keyframed. So if I were to stick the cube over in the corner here, leave the frame and come back, you'll see it didn't retain those changes. So if you see orange fields, that's an indicator that you're on a keyframe. You didn't save the new values, and if you were just testing things out, maybe that's your intent, but otherwise you want to make sure to save those changed values. If you were to put on auto keying and you start moving things around, again, you see the fields turn orange. However, once I put things down, say right in the corner there, you'll see that the properties go back to yellow because auto keying will override the previous values and save the new ones. So again, we'll get off the frame, go back, and everything is saved. So again, auto keying is extremely useful, very convenient feature, and a lot of people usually use it. Let's say you wanted to delete a keyframe. There's a couple ways to go about that. First, make sure you're on the frame of the keyframes you want to delete. Make sure the object is selected. And what you do is go to Object, Animation, Delete Keyframes. You can see the shortcut is Alt-I. Go ahead and click on that. You'll get a OK dialog box. Click Delete a frame again, and you see all of the diamonds are gone in the timeline, meaning we killed all of the keyframes for that object on that frame. I'm going to undo that. Let's say you didn't want to delete all the keyframes for all the properties. Maybe we just wanted to kill the location keyframe. In that case, you can go over to the Properties panel here and right-click on the property where you want to delete the keyframes and select Delete Keyframes. Again, shortcut is Alt-I. And when I did that, we only lost the location keyframes, but we kept all the others. So that would be one way to not nuke everything at once. I'm going to undo that. One more way we can delete keyframes is in the timeline. So if we come down here, and we see all our keyframes, usually everything is selected if you haven't done anything already, so you'll see something like this. So keep in mind you want to click away to deselect everything. Now let's say we wanted to delete the location keyframes on frame 120. We just go ahead and draw a box around them, hit delete, and it's just like before. So there's some other things we can do in the timeline. Generally speaking, the timeline is just to see what objects, properties are being animated and where the keyframes are. But like I just showed you, you can delete keyframes. You can actually move keyframes around. So if you wanted to mess with the timing a bit, you'll notice that most of our animation at the beginning is on the y-axis there. We go up and down the y-axis. Let's say we wanted to delay that. What we can do is select this keyframe here for the Y location and set it a little bit later. And now when we play things, you see it delays and then jumps over real quick. So you can delete keyframes, you can move keyframes around. You can also copy and paste keyframes. So what I'm going to do is use the Shift select to select X, Y, and Z locations. And then I'm still holding down Shift to select their keyframes on frame 0. I'm going to go to frame 160, right click, paste, and you can see the cube went all the way back there. And I'm going to set the end to 160 and we'll watch the animation play out. So setting your ending keyframes to what you had on your first keyframe is a nice way of having your object go back and loop around nice and smoothly. Alright, we'll stop watching the cube. So that is some basics with working with the timeline. If people want to goof around with timing more, they usually use something called the dope sheet. However, when you're just getting started, for most practical purposes, it's pretty much got the same functionality as the timeline. So I will show it to you real quick, but I'm not intending to do anything with it today. So again, it looks very similar. There is a few other options that you can use in here. You'll notice we've got a few extra menu options. But if you wanted to look into that, I invite you to do so on your own. While I am making the executive decision to skip over the dope sheet, we do have to at least peek at the graph editor, because that shows what Blender is doing with your animated property values in between your keyframes. So if we go to the little symbol in the top left corner here, under the animation heading, click on Graph Editor. And that brings up this mess. So these are called F-curves, and again, they represent the values being interpolated for any animated properties of selected objects. And keep in mind, this is just a cube without any rotation implemented. So if you figure you get a full armature in here, it gets extremely messy. So it's worth it to at least talk about how to clean it up, and then we'll look at playing around with at least one of these curves. So the first thing we're going to do, that I've seen pretty much everybody who talks about it do, is you normalize the curves. So what that'll do is make the big curves smaller and the small curves bigger, and put everything on a scale of -1 to 1. So it won't actually change the values, it'll just change how it's displayed in the editor. So I click on normalize and it does this. And again, everything is between 1 and -1. The next thing we can do is get rid of anything we're not playing around with. So let's say we need to goof around with the Y location curve. We can basically turn off everything else, and we do that by clicking on the little eyeballs. So we'll click on an eyeball there, that kills that curve, and you can actually click and drag to turn off a whole row. That leaves us with just this little green line guy. Just like in the timeline, everything starts off selected, so if you didn't want that, again, if we start messing around, you see it plays around with all of the keyframes at once. What you do is you just click away, and there we go. You can't actually click on the line itself, you have to click on one of the keyframe nodes. We'll start off with one in the middle here. And so on frame 80, we can play around with how the animation works, and things are automatically set to smooth curves by default. If you wanted to mess around with how things behave at the keyframes, there's interpolation options over on the right side. I'm not going to go through that right now, but you can do it for the interpolation, the left handle, and the right handle for each keyframe. You can actually move the value around. You can see our cube moving around as I play around with our curve. And again, you can also play around with the handles, which will adjust how things ease in and out of these curves that we're making. So you would mess around with this if you were doing something maybe with an animated character and you have the keyframes right, but the animation between the keyframes wasn't quite smooth enough, or maybe something in the animation needs to be faster or slower. That's where you can come into the graph editor and mess around with how the values are being interpolated. And you can still mess around with the keyframes too, and even add them if you need to. So you just move the playhead to where you want to insert the keyframe, right click, insert keyframes, and we have a new keyframe there. So that's another way to go about doing that. But otherwise, that's as far as I'm going to go with the graph editor today. A fun thing, and it's really cool to look at before you start taking things away. But definitely play around with that to help smooth out your animation. Okay, so we're done with transformation for the day. So it's on to deformation, which is where shape keys come in. Shape keys are a way to animate an object shape without an armature. Although to be clear, with a complicated character setup, you're going to be using both. Shape keys allow you to move and save the position of an object's vertices, although you cannot add nor take them away. For a character, this is used primarily for facial features, muscles, or other soft features, as it allows for more control of the shape versus an armature and weight painting. When you create shape keys, you're going to start off with a reference shape, and that'll be called the basis by default, and all other shape keys are going to use this as their 0 value. Then when you create the shape keys, its value property is going to be the amount of influence it has over the basis value. And this is going to range between 0 and 1, or 0 and 100% influence on the vertices. And you can also have multiple shape keys and their values will stack. And I will show you how that works. Let's go ahead and minimize this and come back to our handy dandy reference cube. Alright, so on the right side here, we're going to go down to this little triangle guy here, Object Data Properties. Click on that, and you can see our list of vertex groups and shape keys, and we don't have anything yet. So let's go ahead and add some. I'm going to click on the plus sign here. Make sure you're in object mode, or this is going to be grayed out. And I'm going to add 2 keys. I'm going to name these shape keys by double clicking on them. We'll name the top one top and the bottom one bottom. The reasoning for the naming will become clear shortly. So now we're going to go ahead and go into edit mode. We'll select the top shape key first. You'll notice the value is grayed out. That'll become available in object mode again, or you can click on this little symbol here for shape key in edit mode, but we don't have to worry about that for right now. So for our top shape key, I'm going to select the top 4 vertices and increase the size. We'll go to 3. There we go. So now we've got our basis. Shape key 1, named top, which looks like that. And for bottom, we'll do the same thing with the bottom 4 vertices. Again, just going to change the size of that bottom face And there we go. Basis, top, and bottom shape keys. I'm going to pull up the timeline a little bit so we can see what's going on. We can go back into object mode. And for all of these, we're going to set keyframes. So for the basis, there's no keyframe there. For top, again, we're looking at this value guy here. And we are going to set a keyframe on frame 1. Same for the bottom. We need to do both to add the keyframe there. And I'm going to turn on auto keying. So let's go ahead and play around. We're going to go to frame 20. And we'll select the top shape key. And we're going to set the value all the way to 1. And you can see what happens there. It works as a slider. We're going to 100% influence. We're going to go to frame 40. This time we'll select the bottom shape key, and we will add that value to 1 as well. So now both of the top and bottom shape keys are having 100% influence on the basis. So again, like I said, these can stack, and that's what's going on here. Move back to 60 here. Select top, put its value down to 0. Go to 80. Select the bottom shape key and set its value to 0 as well. And you can see the colors all changing as I'm doing everything, and that should make perfect sense to you right now. And since we have 80 frames, let's go ahead and set our timeline to 80 frames and see what this looks like. And there you go. That is how you use shape keys for your animation. So that was a brief look into deformation animation. We're going to finish up with an example of inherited animation. And for that, we're going to turn to constraints. Constraints are a way to control an object's properties with values or other objects. Apparently I forgot an apostrophe. Examples include constraining eyes to a focal point and a train car to the cars in front of it. Constraints can be added to an object in the Object Constraint Properties panel. Let's have a look. So the Object Constraint Properties panel is the bottom blue icon. It's got like a circle and a dot, kind of contained in another shape. You click on that, and we've got the option to add an object constraint. But we're not ready to do that yet, because we need an object to constrain to. Now, it might make sense to pull in a sphere and draw an eyeball on it, or maybe even use the monkey mesh, but you know what? The cube has got us this far. Let's let him take us home. So we're going to start with, what am I doing here? I'm going to go into edit mode and make it so we know what our cube is looking at. There we go. So the cube will be pointing at what it's constrained to. And we're going to get back into object mode and add a monkey. If you don't go back into object mode, the monkey is going to be a part of the cube object. So just a refresher. So we'll go ahead and grab the monkey, pull her out. In case you didn't know, the monkey's name is Suzanne. She is the mascot for Blender. Alright, so now with our cube all pointy and a monkey to look at, we're going to add the object constraint. So we'll click on that, and the one we're going to be using is under tracking, and we're going to use damped track. And just so we can see this, I'll pull it out a little bit more. Our target will be the monkey Suzanne. And you can see right off the cube turned away, and that might be the case for whatever you're doing, and that's why we have a track axis option here. So you can go ahead and play with that to make sure you're pointing in the right direction. In this case, we want to track on the x-axis, which makes sense. We're on the x-axis. And now we don't actually animate the cube. The cube will inherit its rotation property from the monkey's location. So we're going to go ahead and animate the monkey here. Go ahead and insert a keyframe for location. And we'll set auto keying on. So we're going to go ahead and grab her. Set her over here, and you can already see our cube is tracking. Let's go to frame 40. Grab Suzanne, move her over here. And then we'll copy the first keyframe. Stick it on frame 80. And we'll cut our animation down to 80 frames. Let her rip. And there you go. That is an example of inherited animation. So I'm going to put off rendering and publishing animations for another video and end it right there. I hope you had fun and were entertained and maybe even learned something. So with that, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good day.